Hey, what's up everyone? I have an opinion, and I think it's an opinion that a lot of people have. And what that opinion is the opinion that American political terminology is just too loose. There's too many words being thrown around without a sharply defined meaning behind them. And there must be a lot of strong contenders for loose terms in America, but one of the top contenders must be the term liberal. When people say liberal in America right now, they mostly use it as a synonym for Democrat or progressive or leftist. And that's a problem for two reasons. One is that it's redundant, even to the point of being confusing. And the other problem is that using it that way actively obscures the political tradition that liberal came from, which is liberalism. And I think as a result, people are losing touch with liberalism. They're not entirely sure what it is or how it fits in with things. And people that do want to call themselves liberals in the way that relates back to liberalism are trying to find these roundabout ways of doing it, saying classical liberal or John Stuart Mill type of liberal, and the whole thing's a mess. So I think we need to sharpen things up. We can't let terms endlessly degenerate into meaninglessness and incoherency. So I thought that I would try to help by going through the evolution of the concept of liberalism in America and going through the different ways that the term liberal was used in the major time periods. And then when we get to the present, I'll make my own argument as to how we could better use the term liberal going forward. So we have a lot to get through. So to make things go faster, I'm going to limit the amount of sources that I show on screen. And for people that are interested, I'll have a little section at the end where I go through them. And that's it. That's the roadmap for the video laid out. We do have people these days that call themselves classical liberals, I think kind of begrudgingly. But we're going to forget about them, and we're going to go all the way back to the 1800s, which gave us our first group of official liberals in America, the classical liberals, who basically workshopped liberalism into a coherent philosophy. They were inspired by a lot of earlier thinkers, but those people are more considered pre-liberals because the word liberal wasn't around yet. So what is liberalism, and who are liberals? What they come up with? Some people answering that question list a set of values that liberals try to embody, like being broad-minded, or having mutual respect backed by law, or being wary of tyrannical forms of power. And I don't think that's wrong, but I think there's one value for liberals that sits up front and center. So for all liberals, this is their most important value, and all these other concerns and values kind of cascade down and stem from that. The one thing that all liberals have in common at the core of their beliefs is the belief in the necessity of freedom. That's not freedom for a community to do what they want. And it's not freedom for a country to do what they want. It's freedom specifically understood at the level of the individual. And then you might say, how much freedom? And liberals would respond, as much freedom as possible. Liberals do believe that we need to constrain freedom in some ways, but it's mostly for the purpose of maximizing freedom. They believe that if we constrain certain malicious uses of freedom, for the rest of society, more freedom is gained, and therefore overall it's something that we should do. So for example, we need to make it illegal to physically hurt other people, and we need to make it illegal to take freedom from someone else. Liberals don't believe that we should protect people from mental harm, because mental harm is too abstract of a concept and too open to abuse, and also just inevitable in a society where people can think for themselves. So liberals, at the core of their beliefs, believe in the necessity of the freedom of the individual, and they try to figure out the necessary compromises needed to secure it and make the most of it. And those freedoms include the right to think for yourself, speak for yourself, and generally pursue your own interests in your own life as you see fit. So here's John Stuart Mill giving his definition of it, who in turn is paraphrasing Adam Smith. Liberals basically imagine the ideal society being like a sandbox that has rules and regulations that everyone needs to follow, like to not hurt anyone. And those are like the borders of the sandbox that need to be very carefully considered and constructed. But once those are set up and people respect them, then people can live within that society doing pretty much whatever they want. So that may sound controlling based on the way that I described that, but they were arguing for a radical amount of freedom at the time, especially compared to their competitors, who may have wanted to interfere more in the thoughts and behavior of others. And in a lot of ways, I think it's still a radical idea now. Classical liberals were in favor of capitalism. They saw it as a humane way for people to provide for themselves and pursue their goals and fulfill natural drives for conflict and competition in a nonviolent way. So they saw conflict as inevitable, and they saw capitalism as a safe and even productive way to channel it. They wanted the state to not intervene in the economy or individuals' capitalistic pursuits, because they thought that the more the state intervened, the more the state would grow in power, and inevitably the state would become tyrannical and overly coercive in the affairs of individual people. So they had a hands-off position with the state, which in their terminology is laissez-faire. As is the case with so many things in liberalism, it's controversial how much classical liberals actually practiced being laissez-faire, but many of them did advocate for it. And that distinguishes them from other types of liberals, because going forward in history, it would be rare for a liberal to go back and even advocate for it. If we were going to add another word to liberalism, it should be the word equality. And things get a little weird here, especially for the classical liberals, because they weren't totally consistent with it. But at least in theory, liberals believe that any freedom we're going to back by law needs to be equally distributed to everyone in society. So it's not good if, say, rich people have one set of rights and poor people have another set. Any freedom that we're going to guarantee needs to be equally distributed to everybody. An important thing to understand is that you can't infinitely support the principle of freedom while also infinitely supporting the principle of equality, because they often come into conflict with each other, and then you have to figure out some sort of compromise between the two. So for example, if you take the principle of equality to mean that there should be equal outcomes everywhere, meaning all people working the same type of job should make the same amount of money, or maybe you think all types of people should be equally represented in every type of job. Liberals would say that the amount of interference it would take in people's lives to make those equal outcomes happen is tyrannical. So it would cost too much freedom and it's just not viable. But if you take the principle of equality to mean equality of opportunity, liberals are generally for that. But then even there's usually a cutoff point. So for example, let's consider the problem of parents wanting to provide for their kids. It's natural for parents to want to give their kids a leg up in life, whether it's hooking them up with a good job, maybe sending them to a good school, maybe giving them a bunch of money, whatever. In a perfectly free society, parents should be able to do as much of that as they want, because it's their freedom to provide for their kids however they see fit. But then if their parents are propping their kids up to positions of power or giving their kids, millions of dollars, while other kids don't have that, then that's also compromising equality. So then a liberal would probably look at that and say, we need to find a healthy compromise here. We don't want to not allow this parent to provide for their kid, because that's taking too much freedom from the parent. So let's find some sort of targeted policy here. Maybe when the parent wants to give an inheritance to the kid, we'll tax that inheritance, and then we'll take that money and we'll put it towards free education, therefore raising equality of opportunity in the rest of society. So that's just a way of saying you can't have a society that has full amounts of both. You can't have a perfectly free society and also a perfectly equal society. And liberals tried to find this sort of healthy balance between the two. So those were principles that were established at the time that were true of classical liberals and are still generally true of liberals now. In other ways, classical liberals were more distinct. So for example, they were pretty elitist. They didn't trust regular, uneducated people and wanted to keep voting to being a privilege. So they thought in order to earn the right to vote, you needed to get an education and also own property. So they did advocate that we should expand education to more people, but they thought until more people received an education, voting should be a privilege. While we're talking about stuff that doesn't age well, classical liberals saw liberalism as a civilizing force in the world. So they thought that societies that had liberalism were civilized, and societies that didn't have liberalism were uncivilized, which they called barbarous. And they thought they had sort of an obligation to spread liberalism around the world. So that sounds pretty bad, but to be fair, you have to realize that they're talking about giving civil rights and education to people around the world that don't have it, and would presumably want it, at least a lot of them would. But they thought that they had to do it imperialistically, which meant that they would basically have to take the place over and educate and civilize the people in that country. And then once those people are deemed able to handle running their own country, they would theoretically give them their country back. If you're wondering where this is coming from, these are generalizations, and classical liberalism basically evolved across the 1800s into that generalization. So different thinkers would contribute different pieces to it, but they themselves typically wouldn't capture the whole. So Tocqueville, for example, talked about the dangers of concentrated power, both in government and in groups of people. And he also talked about the virtues of a society where people looked at each other and roughly saw each other as equal. But if you only read Tocqueville, then you probably won't get a strong sense of what liberalism is or classical liberalism, because his writing just provides pieces of it. So if you're looking for a definitive take on classical liberalism in America, people usually point to John Stuart Mill, who spent his career trying to tie all these liberal ideas together, with On Liberty being his landmark book. So when people talk about classical liberalism, including me, they tend to average together the different ideas that these classical liberals had while throwing out the ones that didn't stick, and if anything, point to John Stuart Mill as the biggest authority on the subject. By the late 1800s, liberal values in a loose interpretation had spread across the broad American public, and liberals themselves loosened up their own position that voting should be an earned privilege, and liberals started to endorse extending voting in a classless way. So as voting rights spread, and as liberal values spread, that introduced a new term, which brings me to the next section, which is called. So a liberal democracy, as you might guess, is a society that's both liberal and democratic. So it has either widespread voting rights or universal voting rights. And it's capitalistic, even if it's some sort of moderated version of capitalism. And it also has civil rights backed by law for everyone in that society. Basically, everything about liberal democracy is controversial. Not everyone agrees even when liberal democracy started in America. Some people say it always was, but most people put it somewhere around the beginning of the 20th century. But it depends what voting rights bill you're looking at that should mark the beginning of it. And some people say that other values come along with it, but all of that's controversial. So some people say that a loose understanding of liberal values is now the default value system of America. Like individualism, this idea that we should look around and see the country as made up of atomized individuals and not in terms of collectives and competing collective interests. Other people argue that we now broadly aspire to be tolerant and mutually respectful because those are qualities that are ideal to have in a society based on the freedom of the individual. But again, that's all controversial. Either way, the creation of the concept of liberal democracy introduced a new meaning for the word liberal, which in this context means someone that supports liberal democracy, meaning that you're for capitalism and meaning that you're for a multi-party democracy, because it can't be a single-party democracy because that's not much of one, and you're for state-backed rights for all citizens. So in this context, most Americans are probably liberal, and certainly all American presidents. So you could also use it to compare different government systems around the world. So you could say, after World War II, Germany was split into two parts. You had the liberal West and the communist East. This also introduced a new type of liberal thinker that especially concerned themselves with the health and relative standing of liberal democracy around the world. So that would be like Karl Popper, or more recently, Francis Fukuyama. And for this video, beyond pointing out those new terms, that's it for liberal democracy. Short section. Once liberal democracy was more or less established, and once America started industrializing as a country, modern liberals were the next group of liberals who tried to make liberalism work in those conditions. One problem is that people liked to proclaim America as the land of the free and equal, but it was just too obviously, in too many ways, not free and equal. And it was being pointed out both in America and abroad as a point of hypocrisy. So one type of modern liberal was a rights-based liberal that basically worked to fix that and worked to extend equal rights to everyone in the country. So that included extending voting rights to everybody and extending civil rights to minorities. Another type of modern liberal focused more on the economy and on quality of life concerns like unemployment or quality of opportunity. And I think at times it can be hard to understand why they're still considered liberals. So I think to wrap your head around where they were coming from, it helps to consider a scenario like this. If you imagine someone that doesn't have somewhere to live, so they're, say, on a street corner somewhere, and they don't have much of an education, and they don't really have a way to afford more, and say they're also discriminated against, say in the job market, and say it's because of their skin color. Their options in their life are going to be windowed down so much that if you go up to that person and say that they have rights guaranteeing their freedom, It kind of makes a mockery out of the concept. So you could give that person food and shelter, but they're still not very free. And then on top of that, if the economy crashes and unemployment skyrockets, that person's going to have even fewer options. So these types of concerns were already in the mix for classical liberals, especially towards the end of the classical liberal period. But it was much more of a thing for modern liberals. And they generally looked to the government and saw the government as a solution to these problems. There was another problem too. As America industrialized, corporations became bigger and more powerful. And liberals started to argue that we needed a bigger, more powerful government to regulate these corporations and maybe even break them up. Some liberals did argue back that the problem mostly takes care of itself. They said that as corporations become bigger, they sort of become like ocean liners that are unwieldy and sluggish to accommodate change. And just naturally, smaller corporations that are sort of sleeker will just overtake them over time. But that was a minority opinion. And especially in the beginning of the 20th century, the prevailing wisdom among liberals was that we needed a bigger government to deal with the challenges of the modern world. So the relationship between liberals and the government was changing. And basically, no one was laissez-faire anymore. But opinions on what exactly that relationship should look like were split into a spectrum of opinion between left and right. Liberals on the left tended to argue that the government should intervene more. It could mean that they took a more active role stabilizing the economy, or it could mean that they took more of an active role trying to make quality of life improvements for the worst off, meaning that they overall took a more welfarist position. Then you also had the liberal right. Their general position is that a rising tide lifts all boats. They thought that less intervention meant more freedom, which meant more economic activity, which meant more prosperity, which overall, in the long run, they said would help everyone the most, including the least well-off. The liberal right were generally more particular about what types of social programs they would support. So they would often, for example, criticize welfare, saying that it was counterproductive and certain forms of it trapped people in dependency. But they were generally more for some types of intervention, like if they had to do with equality of opportunity. If you could find ways that people were being discriminated against, or if you could find ways that market competition was unfair, they, at least in principle, said that those were things that we should fix as long as it doesn't cost too much freedom from other people. In case this helps make any of this more clear, here's some famous names on both sides. Friedman and Keynes were more exclusively economists, and Hayek was also primarily an economist, but he and John Rawls were also influential philosophically for their sides. Not everyone considers people like John Rawls a liberal, especially if you're someone that's more over on the laissez-faire end of the spectrum. But you have to look closely at what they're saying, because John Rawls says that we should only act on interventionist principles if they don't compromise personal liberty, which includes freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of the person, and civil liberties. Even though John Rawls brings in ideas like justice and fairness into his argument, he still centers it around personal liberty, which balances freedom and equality. So most people still consider John Rawls a liberal. He's just saying that once we have personal liberty secured, we should look to help those that don't have very much freedom in their lives. So then if we help them, we'll then have more freedom overall in society. This part isn't discussed as often, but I think that there's another important axis that this liberal conversation happened on in the 20th century, and that axis was culture. When it comes to culture, laissez-faire means let people think, speak, and be themselves. And intervention means some sort of coercion with the power of a group behind it, like censorship. I think it happened in other ways that were less explicitly political and more banal, like academics establishing orthodoxy in their fields and then pressuring others to conform to it. Looking at this superficially, you might expect that this struggle going on in culture would also be between the liberal left and the liberal right, but I don't think it's that simple. The difference is, when it comes to economics, both sides were making arguments based in freedom and equality. So they had different ideas about how to compromise those principles, but fundamentally on both sides they were liberals. When it comes to culture, there was only one side of the argument that was grounded in liberal principles. The other side may have been acting off of just human instincts, or in philosophical principles that are not grounded in freedom and equality. They may be grounded in trying to free people from mental oppression, but liberals don't recognize mental oppression as grounds to restrict the freedom of someone else. It's just too abstract and open to abuse. You can argue that anything is mentally oppressive, and it becomes too easily a means to control other people. So I think that this struggle was between liberals and people who were not liberals. They could have been conservatives, they could have been progressives, or something else, but not liberals. I'm spending a while talking about the major dynamics in economics and culture, because as you may have guessed, I think that these are still the major dynamics in play, and we just don't use the right terms when we talk about it. So I think it's about time that we moved up to present day. If liberalism was controversial up until now, in the 21st century it's especially true, with wildly different competing narratives being thrown around about it. Some people think that we have a new kind of liberalism, which had been developing for maybe a few decades before that. But I don't think that's right. I think we're still in a period of modern liberalism, where, say, 100 years from now, if people look back on this time period, it'll still essentially be an extension of modern liberalism, where the basic liberal ideas haven't changed. Other people are saying that liberalism in America is basically conservatism now. And I think that's oversimplification to the point of just being wrong. Some people are saying that liberalism is dead. And that's not a new claim, and I don't think that's right either. Liberalism isn't dead, it's just being obscured by poor terminology. So who are the liberals in America and who aren't? If you're someone that believes in the principles of freedom, individuality, and equality, and in respecting the civil rights of others, including people you don't agree with, and including their right to free speech, then you're a liberal. There's a spectrum of liberal opinion in America, but those are the basic principles that everyone agrees on. But if that doesn't describe you, and especially if you have negative ideas about liberalism in your head, then I shouldn't have to say this, but you're probably not a liberal. You're probably either a conservative or a progressive. But that being said, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can be inspired by both progressive values and liberal values, or by conservative values and liberal values, and not betray either value system, in which case you could accurately identify either way. But you can also be a progressive and illiberal, or a conservative and illiberal, in which case it would be wrong to identify as liberal. So I think this is where we're at. We have a liberal left and a liberal right in this country. The liberal right that are the most laissez-faire are probably libertarians. We also have liberals that are more moderate and might not want to identify either way. All of them are against censorship, and most of their disagreement comes down to the size of the government and its role in the economy and welfare. We also have conservatives that value tradition, and progressives that want to create progress through social reform. We also have people who take influence from multiple value systems without betraying either one and can identify either way. If we try to simplify our political value set into a simple left and right, where liberal and progressive become synonyms, and the liberal right gets rolled into conservatism, it's just wrong. I understand that we would want to simplify things, but this actively creates confusion and actively obscures liberalism. Liberalism, conservatism, and progressivism are not interchangeable. They're their own political traditions with their own core philosophies that each contribute a distinct voice to American politics. We've been blending them together in the 21st century, but I would argue that it's at liberalism's expense. And if liberals want to continue to be a voice going forward in American politics, I would think that they would need to reclaim their term and insist that we use it in a way that relates back to liberalism. Okay, so my two biggest sources were probably On Liberty by John Stuart Mill and The Constitution of Liberty by Hayek. If you've already read On Liberty, I'd probably recommend this one. It sort of fleshes things out more from a modern liberal right perspective. I read a lot of ebooks and just sort of stuff you can find on PDFs online. Like Keynes, for example, wrote a piece about how he doesn't think laissez-faire is viable for modern liberals, which I would recommend checking out if that's interesting to you. He also wrote a piece about how he identifies kind of begrudgingly as a liberal within British politics. On that note, Hayek had a postscript at the end of his book about how he doesn't identify as a conservative, which was helpful to read. Just to go a little quicker, I read some Rawls, some Milton Friedman, some Tocqueville, two other liberals that aren't known as well that you can find online. One is Hobhouse, that was an early 1900s liberal, and the other one was Walter Lippmann, who's a World War II era liberal that was very popular in his time, but we don't know anymore. Some Francis Fukuyama that does more liberal democracy type of writing. I read some history books too. And out of all those, I'd probably say that this is the most useful one, just called Liberalism by Edmund Fawcett. That was definitely helpful to read. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching. I appreciate all your guys' support, all the thoughtful comments and criticisms and all that. The channel's finally growing without me having to actively find viewers on Reddit, which is nice. And I was just able to monetize, which is also nice. So yeah, things are looking good. Thanks for watching. Appreciate your guys' support, and I'll see you next time.